very much a social cultural process, and to the extent that we use aid dollars, we confuse economic growth as elements that represent development, we're being very wrong. I mean, most of the Arab world, for example, has had great levels of economic growth, but the countries have developed slowly over time, but not nearly as much as the numbers might suggest. So really, development really requires a state and society working together in a way that's a group effort, a societal effort, and only by the nature of the institutions, which is based upon a certain cohesion throughout a society, developing over time, that is development, that is progress. It may not always lead to the same result in every place, but unless there's a society where people are working together on some level, maybe in a city, maybe because there's a historical background where the people have certain loyalties with each other, whatever it may be, unless the society can work to progress as a whole, there's not really any development. I mean, the society does not make any progress. And a very key element I make is that, in my book, is that societies work in one of two ways. Either there's a functioning state or there's a strong informal society that drives progress. And to the extent that no one has a strategy to help the state work well, and society is very fractured and not cohesive, there's no drive for progress. There's only drive for people to take care of themselves or their communities or sub-communities. And unless And until we actually address the fact that the institutions of the state are actually one of the major hindrances to progress, we're not going to help countries develop. And this is what I talked about before, that there's really a dual problem of the state on the formal macro level, and then also the social level. Every country that works around the world that's progressed either has a strong formal state or a cohesive informal society that was able to manage its own affairs. Somaliland works because its informal institutions can control, can discipline, have a rule of thumb law that's recognized. So for Somaliland, it works very well. Somalia, I wouldn't say very, very well, but it works effectively well. You walk the streets of Hargeisa, and people carry around loads and loads of money, and I mean, literally, they're pushing on wheelbarrows hundreds of thousands of local currency, and it's safe, and the security is good because it's an informal mechanism to protect transactions, to protect the streets, what have you. You go to Somalia, where there's no informal mechanism and there's no formal state, and the society's fragmented by clan, and now it's more complicated, especially in the South over the last few decades. But without a formal mechanism to discipline society does not work. It breaks down, and then there's a loop between the informal and the formal, and chaos results. And there's no rule of law, there's no social capital, the society doesn't work. So if you're trying to build a successful state, either you're going to spend decades trying to fix the formal sector, or probably more likely, given the international capacity to actually help states formally, you're going to have to leverage the informal fabric, the informal grain, as I think a paper written by ODI, the grain of society, or as I would call it, the fabric of societies. Unless you're going to ride the fabric, ride the social cohesion, ride the institutions that are already working, you're not going to be able to leverage what people can do by themselves. An international community cannot really fix fragile states. They can just encourage processes that are already working on the ground to work more effective, and building from bottom up in most cases. A little bit of top-down is required, but bottom up, leveraging those institutions' capacities and building states this way. It's a very different idea of how states might work. And the usual prescriptions I've talked about doesn't really address these issues. So in reality, I've mentioned most of these points. I won't go through them. The key point is the current approach to state building doesn't really have a strategy for each country, doesn't attempt to use local resources, in many ways suffocates local societies. The intention is good, the desire to help is good, but the approach in some way doesn't have sufficient empathy. We empathize with the problem, but in reality we have to empathize with the worldview. We have to empathize with how people see their lives, see their societies, see their networks, and I would argue our empathy is not enough. Yes, we empathize and we want to do something to help. Yes, we want to give money. Yes, we want to help end poverty in the world. This is a great calling, but real empathy needs to go beyond this. Real empathy means you walk the streets of a favela in Brazil, or you walk the street, you travel to the Andes, or you walk the streets of a huge city in Africa, or you spend time in Pakistan or Central Asia, wherever it might be, and you really try to understand it. What do these people see, and what is it about their lives and their social networks and their clans or their tribes or their loyalties or their capacities or the way they manage their affairs? What can we do to make these things the basis for state building and connect the formal and the informal? And that requires a degree of empathy much greater than what we practice right now in many Western countries, if I may use a Northeast Asian perspective to explain that a little more. And of course, as a businessman, unless private capital, when people invest, they invest and they build a future. When no one's investing, I mean education for children, I mean factories. Factories means employment, means productivity gains, means rising income, means change in institutions of society. It means pressure for better governance. Unless there's factories, unless individual families are willing to invest and build better homes and build small businesses, countries do not invest. I'm going to jump over this, but the key point is you have to have a self-sustaining, locally driven governing system to make states work. And to the degree that things are dependent upon outsiders, the states are never going to work. That means, again, local capacities, local resources must drive a process forward. We can help the help the processes along. We can add skills. We can help make states work better for local people, but to the degree that what we do works against the grain, works against the fabric, we work against the processes, we work against the capacities. The way I look at it is very much an anthropological or a sociological or a very political approach to state building. I do not think state building is driven by economics or by quantitative econometric models. State building is very much driven by the politics and the social cultural fabric, and to the extent that we help people govern their societies better through little accountability loops and urban-based models and leveraging traditional identities and helping the state reinforce cohesion, this will make states work better. To the extent we work against that, which is what we mainly do now, we don't help state building. This is what I talk about. This slide is the key slide of my my talk. I need about 6 or 7 minutes. I'm watching the clock. Don't worry. We very much have what I would say an imbalanced approach or an unbalanced approach to development, and each of these bullet points here would talk about a much more balanced approach that would lead to better state building. Yes, we have to strengthen the central state, but we have to make the state foster cohesion, whether it's national cohesion or urban-based, regional-based pockets of cohesion. Yes, we want to have democracy in elections, but unless we bridge the ethnic, religious, clan divide in society by how the state is structured, again, either locally, regionally, nationally, unless we do more of that, elections can actually lead to a negative result. Security is important in many ways over individual rights in the short term. I think Iraq would be a great example of that. We want to balance traditional and Western style governing. We need good economic policies. We definitely need good policies and good leadership. I don't mean to devalue leadership is everything, policy is everything, but we need to build cohesive communities. We integrate the informal and the formal, and we need very much bottom-up states. The state really is the key to development, but to the extent that we don't make a state that has a long range, a long-term chance to be sustainable and representative and functioning, the state is never going to work. And of course, we need, if people don't invest, there is no future. So here's some innovations, and after this I just have a few simple case studies I'm going to go through very quickly. These are some things we don't do, we can do much more. If you study European history, there's been 2 models of state building. The model that we generally recognize is the French model, the post, I think it would be the 14th, Louis the 14th, or the Napoleonic model, centralized state building. But the alternative model, which existed in the old Swiss Confederacy up until the 18th century, to some degree even till this day, Holy Roman Empire, Italian city-states. This other model, which is mainly forgotten today, actually offers some very interesting ways that states might work better in fractured societies. Unless we teach much more in the local language, certainly a lot more people might learn better if schools were in Hausa, or if schools were in Punjabi, or whatever it might be, as opposed to Western languages. Most people in most Aymara, you travel around Bolivia, the Western language is not the first language for most people. Somewhat controversially, I also would argue that aid is not really, money helps, but really the Western countries or international community could be most helpful sometimes by taking one important institution in a country and helping that one institution work better and letting the society develop sometimes there's 1 or 2 main institutions that hold back whole society, whether it's security, whether it's natural resource management, whether it's judicial, rule of law, and to the extent that we can intervene in one specific area, society might be able to progress much more on its own around that one strongly rooted one institution which over time would be localized and outsiders could leave. But to the extent we don't focus on building one or two really, really effective institutions, everything else just, it's an infinite loop of problems over problems. The path dependency would be the word, that just unless you break the path dependency, you're not going to have progress. And there's a few more here. And just some quick examples. Somalia, I think, would be the greatest example of why of this approach in action. If you travel to Hargeisa, to a lesser degree, you travel to Bosaso and Puntland, but especially Somaliland, it's not beautiful, it's not perfect, it's messy, but it works. It's lots of goods in the shop, security's on the street, people have confidence, people are investing. I personally don't dare to go to Mogadishu, so I really can't speak from that, but I think the news will tell you very easily what 14 attempts and $8 billion have yielded in centralized state building. I think this is a great example of a case for horizontal state building, as is the Congo, as is many other very fractured societies. The DRC, again, the DRC is special because its political geography, plus its infrastructure, plus its history makes it an impossible case, but as the natural resources, weak governance, weak security, natural resource wealth is easily attainable. This country is never going to work using a Western top-down model. It's simply unrealistic. Yet we just spent $500 million having national elections. Why don't we try an urban-based approach, local elections, try to build coalitions around pockets of cohesion or build pockets of cohesion in, I argue, 21 cities. And you need a national government to do some things, but projection of authority is very weak in fragile states, especially in Africa, and therefore Kinshasa works, but most of the Congo doesn't work. And until we think differently, you're not going to make lots of progress. Bolivia, if you want to travel to one fragile state, go to Bolivia, one of my favorite places, especially La Paz, and a few other parts of the country as well. Here's a good example. It's a little bit different history because it was colonized for hundreds of years, but it's the highest percentage of indigenous people in Latin America, South and Central America, and there's a country that is, in some ways, would do better with a federal or a decentralized model. It really is like two different identity groups arguing back and forth, a completely different worldview about the role of the state, the role of investment, and certainly some compromise is called for there. But if the current president had been a Nelson Mandela, you might have had much more progress these few years. Nelson Mandela basically said, we rule, but we let you keep your economic model, and we slowly over time will spread more resources to make it a more equitable state. Hasn't worked to perfection, but to a certain degree it's worked very well. Bolivia, they're not taking that approach, so the conflict within the country is only likely going to continue. Syria, which is usually not mentioned as a fragile state, is a great example of a fragile state waiting to happen. Syria is as complicated as Lebanon and Iraq, but has an authoritarian government. If it was ever an attempt to introduce democracy or an attempt to open up the system too dramatically or reforms just too fast, you might have a repeat of what happens in the country and the neighbors. Most of the Middle East does not work, not because people don't have great capacities and great resources. In fact, they do, as the Arab Emirate states, which work generally very well in terms of governance, in terms of progressing, in terms of development. These other states need to find ways to leverage their resources. And just summing up at the very end here, the main point I want to lead you, I'm about 5 minutes over, so I apologize for that. The problem with fragile states in many cases is that they are systematically, institutionally disadvantaged. And to the extent that we don't deal with the systematic problem, we're not going to solve their problems. And the way we approach state building right now, we ignore the social, cultural aspects of development. We ignore the differences between states. We don't have a more creative approach. And to this extent, until we deal with that issue, we're not going to help these countries. And that development is very much a group approach. But we never discuss the group aspect of development. And to the extent that you don't build cohesive groups with high social capital, you're not going to address the macro and micro problem of development. The macro being that there's not a consensus on a society-wide basis to drive development forward, and also there is not, on the micro level, the social capital to make people want to invest in the future and have secure property, secure business transactions. And until you deal with that, and the key point is, if you had greater social capital, the people can manage their affairs very effectively. We just don't give them a chance the way we approach development right now. The effect that you build these groups of cohesion, you're going to make them much more able to manage their own affairs and not depend upon us. And while we want to help, they really have to drive the process forward. And again, investment matters. These countries badly need our help, but they need our help in a different, more creative way. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. That's the time. David.
I'm a little bit late. So. Okay. I apologize for not being at Ina Rocha Benucar, which is something I can't do anything about, but she's very close to giving birth, and that's the reason why she didn't want to do this job today. This is the book. It's a very good book, I think. I want to say sort of four things about it. Some of these comments agree with what Alina would have said about it. Some of them are not quite the same as what Alina would have said about it. It's a particularly good book, by the way, in the way it elaborates on these country case studies. There's much more in the chapters than appeared on the slides. The first thing I want to say is that this book provides a real theory about fragile states. I mean, we're accustomed to having this fragile states category around in the development business, and it's a really flabby category. It's just based on a particular sort of cutoff point in a set of World Bank statistics. What Seth provides us with is a theory of actually what the problem is in fragile states, what is the cause of fragility, and what needs to be done about it. And you will have different views about whether he's right or he's wrong, and about how new the ideas are, but there's no doubt what he's offering is something which we haven't had until now. It's a theory which says what the problem is. It's a theory which begins to fill the empty box which is being created by the concept of a political settlement in the discussions about fragile states recently. One of the big innovations in thinking about fragile states recently is the proposition you have to have a political settlement if you're going to be successful in building states. But it's an empty box because nobody really has said what a political settlement consists of. They're telling us what it consists of. It consists of a sort of fundamental agreement at the group level about how to share power. And because it's a real theory, it also brings with it some concrete suggestions about what to do differently, which is also something that's been severely lacking. Aid donors like DFID have moved towards doing sort of political analysis of country contexts to inform what they do, and the information has improved, but an awful lot of that analysis has failed to lead to the donor agencies actually doing something different. And part of the problem has been that people can't imagine exactly what they would do differently. Seth Kaplan is telling us what exactly one should be doing differently. I have some reservations about some of his recommendations, which I'll come back to at the end, but he's at least putting something on the table. Secondly, the book is subtitled A New Paradigm for Development, and it is a real challenge to several paradigms, not just to the prevailing paradigm in the development business. I mean, actually, the development business, if one's speaking about the sort of technical people in the development agencies, they've already moved some way towards recognizing these kinds of issues, and the problem is actually changing the practice. And changing the practice is the problem partly because they're under a political leadership which hasn't quite switched on to these issues yet. But more importantly, I think it's a challenge to the prevailing paradigm in northern countries regarding democratization and its relationship to development. Seth is saying if there's something important about democratization, it's got to do with having a relationship between fundamental groups defined in identity politics terms, and not about the holding of elections, and certainly not about promoting a multi-party competitive political system. Now, you may agree or disagree with that, but it's a real challenge to the prevailing paradigm, not just in Whitehall, but in the street outside. It's a major challenge to the conventional northern view of what you need to do to improve the business climate in poor countries, because he's saying it's not the standard formal institutions which are promoted by the World Bank and others that is going to do the trick in very poor countries. It is in fact the informal institutions which perform the same sorts of roles in creating trust and reducing the transaction costs that investors face. And lastly, and most importantly, or most dangerously you could say, he's asking us to reconceptualize the role of ethnicity in development. He uses the phrase identity politics much of the time, but what he's actually talking about is ethnicity, people's sort of fundamental identity groups. Along with the other ideas, the idea about democracy, for example, we've got here a dangerous set of ideas, and I give dangerous a sort of positive connotation. These are exactly the kinds of sort of novel ideas which shake up our current conventional wisdoms that we actually need. Let me focus as my sort of third point on this question about ethnicity, and this is one of the areas in which Alina's reading the book and mine are a bit different. It is controversial to suggest that people's basic ethnic identity should be playing a greater role in development and in the formation of states than it does at present. And it's controversial not only because we know that ethnic conflict is always around the corner, but also because the sort of academic world has become accustomed to arguments about how ethnicity is constructed and states and nationalities are constructed. And with each sort of passing decade, we get a new book with a title like The Invention of Tradition, which must have been the 70s, I guess. Imagined Communities in the 80s, the Anderson book about state formation in the West, and Bayar's book of the 80s on the illusion of cultural identity. And these books are all very good books, and they've made some very good points about the fact that identities are not sort of immediately given. They're not something that is sort of biologically passed on. They are things which are actively constructed by people. But I have a feeling that, in fact, there's been so much writing along those lines that we've actually begun to forget that ethnicity is not entirely constructed, or that to the extent it is constructed, it's constructed on the basis of things which are objective, things which are given to us from the past or from facts of geography and so forth. I mean, I'm reminded of the sort of classic remark of Karl Marx about men making their own history but not making it just as they please. Men make their own identities, men construct their own identity politics, they create their own nations, but they don't do it just exactly as they please. They do it on the basis of things which are not changeable in the short term, which are legacies of history. And Seth's argument is bringing that back into the center of the stage and suggesting that if we were more capable of recognizing that fundamental fact, we might be less surprised when things go down the tubes in Iraq following the invasion, the way conflict broke out, the scale on which it broke out in Kenya after the last elections, and so forth. So it seems to me that although there are two sides of this argument about ethnicity and politics, that Seth is giving the corrective, which we probably need at this particular point in world history. Finally, this is my sort of seriously negative point. What I like about the book is that it's encouraging us to do different things, and I'd like very much the slide on doing things differently. But as Alina said in her comments to me, one of the things that she's been trying to argue with DFID and other donors in recent years is that it's not the case that all good things go together. There are trade-offs. If you want to create a stable society which advances economically, you may have to give something on the democracy promotion front. Agencies in the north, which presume to intervene in the south, need to be aware that they can't have everything. They do need to make choices. And I think that is really a very strong argument for making those choices in a slightly different way. I worry, though, about his slide number 10, which is about the balanced approach, that seems to take a little bit back to doing a bit of this and a bit of that, and not really sort of annoying anybody by, for example, questioning the role of multi-party elections. So a really good book. I think I do recommend you all to read it.